What's up guys, today we're building KFC. Sara is a strong electro burst support unit who gets a lot of value from being built as an electro burst DPS as well. And I know a lot of people want her to be a main DPS and you can build her that way, but her damage really isn't that competitive with a lot of other 4-star units outside of her burst. So today in this build guide, we're going to be focusing on how to build her as a burst support and how to get the most value out of her kit, weapons, artifacts, and teams. Before we get started, I wanted to let you guys know that I go live on Twitch a few times a week at twitch.tv/braxphone, where we live test things, and we'll be streaming soon after the patch drops, so drop a follow if you want to come hang out. Without further ado, let's get right into Sara's kit. So Sara actually has a really interesting kit. What makes Sara good is how she's able to fill Bennett's niche in electro teams, and while she's not as good as Bennett overall, she brings a lot of value to the right compositions. So let's get started with her elemental skill. So first thing you need to know is that when Sara casts her elemental skill, there's no initial hit of damage. What it does instead is it gives her a buff called Crow Feather Cover for 18 seconds. The buff makes it so that your next aim shot drops a small AoE that deals damage, and it'll give you a pretty big attack buff if you're within the area of it. In order to get the buff, you actually have to be standing in the AoE circle, and the circle's really small, so you have to be within melee range of the enemies that you hit to get the effect, meaning that shields are really helpful to making sure you're able to pick up the buff. Similarly to Bennett, the buff scales off of her base attack, which means that weapon base stats will matter, but attack percent artifacts and weapon main stats won't matter. Her attack buff is also really short at 6 seconds, but certain characters can snapshot it, kind of like Bennett's burst, so Sara is best played with those characters. Her passives also make her skill a little bit better, but we'll talk about that in a sec. Moving on to Sara's elemental burst now, her burst is really strong, and scaling is pretty high to compensate for lack of reactions. She does a large hit of damage on cast, and lightning strikes continue outwards in an X shape, and Constellation 4 actually changes the 4 lightning pads into 6, so you get more AoE coverage. When Sara casts her burst, her Crow Feather buff from her skill activates and gives the same attack bonus, so you can use her burst before switching characters and snapshot the buff afterwards. Also, this means that if you pick up her elemental skill's Crow Feather buff, you can use it to buff Sara's own burst, and then that burst will reset the timer, meaning that Sara's burst will also get the same attack bonus. Unfortunately though, the burst alone won't activate the buff for Sara in time for the first big hit. So moving on to passives now, Sara's first passive makes it so that when she has Crow Feather Cover, her aim shot charge time decreases by 60%, which means you'll be able to get her Crow Feather attack buff up faster. If you have to aim for less time, that means less downtime between characters, and it'll add up over a long fight. Now Sara's second passive is something that I actually want to clarify because I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions in the community about it right now. The skill reads that characters in your party get 1.2 energy for every 100% energy recharge she has, but it's actually a really bad translation. I tested it out and you can see it on screen. Crossing the 200% energy recharge threshold didn't really change the amount of energy gain from 197%, meaning that it doesn't only move in increments of 100, it's actually giving 0.012% energy for every 1% energy recharge that you have instead. So that means that at 200% energy recharge, your team will be getting 2.4, but you can also split that in half and go 150 and get 1.8 energy. It's honestly not a lot of energy return, but it does help a little bit with energy generation. It's just a nice bonus. And her third passive just makes her fast at Inazuma commissions. In terms of talent leveling, if you're making her a support or burst DPS, you're going to want to prioritize her skill and then her burst. The reason you want to prioritize skill is because her skill is what the attack buff is based on. And if you want to level autos, you can, but you'll basically never use them outside of charge shop. You shoot for the buff. So I don't really think it's worth it, but you do you. Since Sara's a 4-star, many of you guys will be getting Constellations for her, so I want to talk about which ones are the best and what each one does. Her Constellation 1 makes her cooldown on her burst decrease whenever she gives out an attack buff. It's good, but it's not really that strong. Her Constellation 2 makes her leave a Crow Feather at her feet when she uses her burst, and it does slightly less damage, but it does apply the buff. Constellation 3 upgrades her skill, and Constellation 4 makes Sara's burst have 6 lightning pads instead of 4. Constellation 5 upgrades her burst, and Constellation 6 is her best support constellation. It gives electro damage 60% more crit damage after the attack buff from Sara is activated, which is going to make burst that snapshot and Sara's burst as well much stronger as long as they deal electro. In terms of value from best to worst, the priority is C6, C2, C4, and C1. C6 is obviously her best one, but C2 is going to get you a lot of value, so I definitely recommend going for that if you're just looking to get Sara a little bit upgraded. Now that we've talked about her entire kit, we can move on to her artifact build, and this is going to be for burst support, which prioritizes buffing the rest of your team and doing a little bit of damage on the way out. So Sara can actually take advantage of a few different sets, but I want to talk about the 2 best ones. The first set I want to talk about is Emblem of Severed Fate. The nice thing about this set is that it encourages you to build energy recharge and gives you elemental burst damage in exchange. With the emblem, set, you want to build at least 200% energy recharge just because that's going to get you 50% more damage. And you can build more than that, but the return on investment isn't great since you'll need to sacrifice crit substats. 160% is a comfortable amount for characters with 80 cost bursts, but building lots of ER will help Sara's battery potential and give your burst damage slightly less with Emblem of Severed Fate. So that's the first set I recommend, but if you're not really feeling Emblem of Severed Fate, you can build her with 4-piece Noblesse. Now her cooldown is 20 seconds on her burst, so you won't be able to have Noblesse up all the time, but since Sara more or less fills the spot that Bennett does in a team, giving her Noblesse makes a lot of sense. You'll take a tiny bit of a hit to your own burst damage, but the extra attack buff on top of her own will enable your carries to do a lot more damage. For artifact stats, your main stat will depend on your weapon, and generally whatever's going to get you closer to 160% energy recharge is best for Noblesse, but if you're using Emblem, you'll likely want to use an energy recharge Sans. If you can get that energy recharge with attack percent Sans, that's ideal, but if you need ER Sans, then just use it. As far as Goblet goes, electro damage is usually the best, but if you run energy recharge Sans, attack Goblet can also be competitive depending on the substats. Generally between the two, pick the one with the better substats if you're using an energy recharge Sans, but just generally speaking, electro damage will be better. Finally, you're going to want crit rate or crit damage in the last spot on the circlet, but if you have C6 Sara, you're probably going to be aiming for crit rate circlet since she's already able to buff your crit damage. You want a 40 to 80 ratio of crit rate to crit damage, so about a 1 to 2, but if you can't make 40 to 80 happen, build attack on the circlet because that'll net you more damage. For substats, crit rate is about equal to crit damage, which is better than energy recharge, which is better than attack percent, but those are ideal. So now that we've talked about artifacts, we're going to move on to weapons. And I'm not going to go over every single weapon, but I'll list some of the best ones, including free-to-play options for a burst support build. The weapon sheet I referenced included overall kit damage, but I'm only taking into account burst and skill damage since you won't really keep her on the field for autos as a support. For 5-star weapons, Skyward Harp will be the best weapon for her since it's the easiest to plug and play and has the best stats for her overall. From a technical standpoint, Thundering Pulse is a better stat stick. It's better by like 200 damage on the sheet that I referenced, but it's not really enough to justify using it over Harp, especially since Harp gives out crit rate and damage. But if you don't have access to those, Sacrificial Bow is great for getting a bit of extra energy out of her passive, and its base attack is decent for a 4-star. Amos Bow is fine. Elegy is a good option because it gives a passive attack and has energy recharge main stat, and Stringless can be used on Sara for burst support since it'll buff your burst and skill. Blackcliff Warbow and Viridescent Hunt are great for the crit they give, and if you're free to play and you don't have access to any of the listed bows, Prototype Crescent will be fine and overall better than Hamayumi just due to the attack buff. If I had to give my top recommendations, it would be Skyward Harp for 5 stars or Sacrificial Bow for 4 stars. Sacrificial Bow is just a really great 4-star ER weapon because it helps with your buffs, but otherwise Prototype Crescent should be the way to go. There are timestamps if you haven't noticed, so you can go back and rewatch that if I move too fast for you. But now it's time to talk about teams, and this teams talk is a little bit different from my normal videos because normally in my videos I give you a couple different teams to try, but the thing is there are a lot of situations where you would use other characters over Sara in the same teams, so it's a little awkward building like best in slot teams for her, especially because there's so many places she can go, but not necessarily be best in slot in. The nice thing about Sara though is that she fills both a nuke spot and a buff spot in your party. She's pretty flexible, with the one caveat being that she needs to have a second electro character and reactions to make sure you get electro resonance. She can battery, but not as strong as she needs to always ever burst up, but she's really great with Beto, especially at C6, so I highly recommend running Beto with Sara in all of these teams. As mentioned earlier, since Sara's buff is really short, it's really good to play characters with abilities that snapshot. For example, Xiangling's burst snapshots would allow you to keep the attack buff through all of her Pyronado. That being said, Xiangling prefers Bennett to Sara due to Pyro Resonance, and Bennett's battery capabilities are better. Oz can also snapshot damage, so pairing Sara with Fischl to make the ultimate bird team is pretty good. Though Raiden doesn't snapshot, Sara can be a good pairing with her since Raiden will fill Sara's burst quickly and vice versa. Sara can also buff the initial hit of Raiden's burst with C6, making it 60% more crit damage stronger. And one last team suggestion I have is to use a grouping character like Sucrose, Kazuha, or Venti since Sara's burst starts inward and goes out, because that means that you'll be able to get a big initial hit on all enemies as well as Viridescent Venerer Shred to debuff the rest of the coming hits that happen over time. It ends up making Sara a lot stronger. A lot of people are wondering about Eula, and the thing is, Eula can be played with Sara, but you have to make accommodations like ending her burst slightly early to take advantage of the attack percent buff, but depending on your Eula stacks during burst, it might actually be better to just finish the combo than to get Sara's attack buff. As mentioned before, it's pretty hard to create full teams for Sara that fully utilize her, but I'm sure in the future she's going to complement a lot of characters very well. As she is right now, she's my other Bennett for the other side of the abyss, and I would recommend you do the same thing because she's awesome for that role. Anyways, that about wraps up the guide, you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like the video if you've enjoyed. It really helps me out, and I would love if you guys could get me going in the algorithm. Comment down below what you're going to be building with your Sara or what team team you like to use with her, and make sure to subscribe if you're not already and you want to see more Genshin Impact stuff. I will catch you guys later. Have a wonderful day.